Hello and welcome to Generally Speaking. Today is July 6th, 2026. Let's start the ball with some activities in Africa and Burkina Faso. I seem to be focusing on this continent because I opened up a feed that told a story and I keep getting feeds. So, Burkina Faso, one of three states, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, that formed an alliance called the Alliance of Sahel States. Sahel is a region. I don't know if it just includes them or more, but there they are. At any rate, they were one time French colonial powers, and now they've become free, but they're not exactly free because you know how colonial powers are. They always want to keep their fingers involved, and so the but people in Burkina Faso decided that the French were getting too involved, and decided to sever ties completely with France. And how did the French react to this? The French Foreign Ministry spokesperson called it a hostile action. Imagine that if you say, listen, I don't want to deal with you anymore, and that person calls it a hostile action. I think that says, yeah, you were in a bad relationship and breaking up was a good thing to do. All right, Burkina Faso also severed relations with International Criminal Court, saying the court only finds criminals seem to be in Africa and nowhere else. Well, you know how courts are, they're headed by people and people have their prejudices. And if one thing you can always be sure is the rich and powerful never get looked at, and the African nations as a whole are the less powerful of the countries on earth. So could be something very much to that. So if you like this, by the way, please give me a like, a subscribe, and notify. We all love that, us YouTube people. This is from Lena Petrova. She is hosting a site called World Affairs in Context. And she's talking about Germany suffering economically in terms of Volkswagen, considering 100,000 layoffs and possibly four plant closures, and citing reasons that they need to remain competitive. Wow, four plant closures and 100,000 layoffs. You know what a shock to the economy. This is a site called Legal AF. Trump attacked the British Broadcasting Corporation over a film they did, an episode they did, in which it cited Trump's Oval speech about when he was being elected, when the elections were results were coming in. He said, "Everybody march to the Capitol, and we have to fight. We have to fight for our rights." And Trump claims that they left out the part where he said, "We'll march peacefully." And you know what? Those are two things that were in that speech: march peacefully, and that we'll have to fight. So you want to say, all right, they cancel each other out, and then point to other things for making whatever story you want to make about that. So, anyway, so he attacked the BBC, and now he's starting to worry about it because a lot of disclosure has to be presented. If you want to bring a case to court, you have to, say everything that you can about what happened. And the BBC says, listen, we want copies of this, that, and the other thing. And they're going to be very embarrassing for Trump to have to show these things because, yeah, he said march peaceful, but the whole emphasis of everything wasn't so peaceful. All right, just was looking at some things about travel, and I saw a little thing on the city of Angkor in Cambodia, and this was a huge, powerful empire at its height, part of the Khmer Empire, and now it's just gone. Now it's ruins with overrun with trees. It's amazing how something that could be so alive and vibrant at some point and become a nothing, 1,000 years later. All right, Harriet Tubman. Fourth of July we're on, and there's a lot of Juneteenth was just recently, so we get some Black history. Harriet Tubman was known to be on the Underground Railroad, and that's what she's famous for. But did you know that she also would guide Union boats down the rivers and get them past where Confederate armaments were posted? This woman was more than just lead people, through the dark. She was very active in the warfare going on events. There are so many stories, that we just don't know about, and they come out during these special events. It's nice hearing about them. All right, there's a legal suit moving along to get the Epstein files, and it's gotten some traction. And the DOJ wasn't going to release them. They have like 6 million something files that they won't let go. So a young lady, a journalist, was suing to get these files, and looks like she might get them in unredacted form. Be interesting to see what comes of that. All right. This is from a podcast called Frontline Africa. This is where I get most of my Burkina Faso information and other things, Africana. Senegal is weakening the power of the president in favor of the parliament and prime minister. So many of these countries in Africa, having been under colonial rule not too long ago, are still going through growing pains, are still adapting and finding out what works, what doesn't work, and making changes. And some of them are making good changes, and some of them are making, poor changes. And it's just an interesting, it's a political scientist's, dream, watching how these things unfold. So this story is from a young lady, calls her site The House of L. Her name is L. I don't know if it's Eleanor or what, but her story was about the Netherlands reacting to the United States pushing through legislation called the Match Act. I don't know why it's called Match, but the idea is that sales of lithography gear, the kind of stuff that makes silicon chips in computers, have to be restricted going to China. And the Netherlands said, you want to say that? Fine, you do that. But we are not going along with that. And in particular, one company was the focus of this resistance. It's ASML. And believe it or not, and this is very amazing, they are the only ones that produce lithography equipment for making these micron chips, these small, tiny chips. And I don't know how that could happen. I don't know any one company that gets the whole market. And no, everybody wants to make money. You'd think there'd be other companies going out there. Oh, I'll make one. I've got one. Could be that there's not a big demand for it. They're very expensive, and who's got the technology, to go making chips? And so they were the first ones out of the gate. They've got all the contracts, and people, no, don't need any more. We got all we need from ASML. All right, so what's this? This was someone studying biology and was trying to see if they could create artificial life. And they made something, sort of it, just using a bunch of chemicals. And so they've got something called spud cells, and they react similar to life. They've got a lot of the characteristics of life. They can reproduce. They do other things, whatever. And they specifically say, no, these aren't life. But we're just saying we're moving in the direction where we can make little blobs of, floating around stuffs that act like life. And so interesting to see how this stuff will develop. And the discussion of life in itself is an interesting thing. I mean, when you say what is life, and it's, well, it's anything that can reproduce, anything that can this or that or the other thing, it still doesn't really touch on what life is. When a person is on death's bed, let's say, and they're coming near the end, and this is it, and they breathe their last, what happened? What is the life that left them? Exactly. It's just such an interesting topic to me. And speaking of things in a similar vein, AI. I've been reading some discussions lately about AI and consciousness. Does AI have consciousness? It can act like a human. You can ask them questions, have conversations with them, sound like you're talking to a person, but it's just, really a glorified calculator. You put some input in, you get some input out. But it was interesting to think, what suppose they did have consciousness? Would it, if you shut it down, would that be the same thing as killing it? Or suppose if it has consciousness and it's doing the jobs you programmed it to, are they like slaves? Could they possibly, not like what they're doing? Of course not, Bill. They're just, silly machines. All of that is just dumb questions. All right, so world affairs in context. Again, Lena Petrova. U.S. oil reserves are the lowest since 1984. There's a lot of discussion about the oil restrictions with the Iran war, and our gas prices shot up in this country, but now they're all dropped back down again. They're still higher than they were before the war, but they've dropped down considerably. You almost think, oh, everything's rosy again, nothing's wrong. But I think a lot of this is just depleting our natural resources inside the petroleum reserve tanks. They're near empty. The reserve tanks that private businesses have are near empty. And so what's on the horizon? The price is going to skyrocket again sometime. I hope not, but they might. Trump declares a national emergency for phosphate. Phosphate, one of the most important chemicals for agriculture. And one of the places it comes from is through the Gulf, where oil also comes from. So phosphate's on, the hot list of things we need. We need them. So what did he do? Part of the emergency, he's going to remove restrictions on Morocco to export phosphates. Morocco. Why are there any restrictions on Morocco in the first place? Morocco is the highest has the highest reserves of phosphate on the planet. And now we're going to let Morocco give us those phosphates. Amazing what kind of changes you'll go through when you no longer have food. Yeah, eventually things like these, they come to make a person move, don't they? In Paris, it got up to 107 degrees. I actually thought I saw something said 111 at one point, and I was watching a commenter saying, and people are still not wearing deodorant, which is a problem. Yeah, I tell you, deodorant is the least of your problems. Ukraine has been hitting inside Russia. I've seen one of my channels is a pro-Ukraine channel, and they're talking about Russia suffering. Look at these tanks blowing up. Look at these hits in Russia. Well, Russia's hitting back, and so the war is just going on. What's going to happen? Who's going to win? Us watching this, it almost seems like, well, there's war going on, but is anything happening? There's a war going on. Is anybody winning? We don't really get too many updates. But any rate, next person, Danny Hai Fang. He was talking about an upcoming NATO summit meeting that Trump will demand more cash for U.S. arms companies, and the U.S. will say yes and pay for it because they always say yes to these arms requests. And how will they pay for it? Well, the old-fashioned way, austerity, taking away social programs from the population. The U.S. says jump, and the EU says how high, or another person said it as bend over and how hard, which is a bit more crass, but more descriptive. All right, we got Todd Blanche, acting Attorney General for the United States, was told by the courts that he had to provide documentation saying there is not going to be a slush fund payment to Trump. Todd Blanche said there won't be one, but people can say whatever they want. The court wants documentation, and Todd says, no, I'm not going to do it. And so the courts are going to go ahead with saying, all right, well, we're going to end up blocking this thing. And he should be held in contempt. But contempt for rich people just never seems to happen. All right, the back to Burkina Faso, the Alliance of Sahel States. They just recently formalized a parliament amongst themselves. So they're growing in stability and stature and solidification. Parliaments among states are an interesting, effort. We've got the EU did a really good job. We've got all those countries are all now, working under the EU. They all have their own rights. I'm sure none of them just gave up complete sovereignty, right? But so often you get other organizations, like a perfect example is the United Nations, where they're almost just a place for talking. They can't really do anything. Just a place for having discussions. All right, let's go on to this story about Canada has decided to reduce tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. And how much? Well, they were at 100%, and they've reduced it to 6%. So now the world recognized better class Chinese electric vehicles are coming to Canada soon, and who knows how long before they come to the U.S. An interesting thing I was reading about Tesla decided to move some of their plants to China and reduce the price from like $40,000 for a vehicle, no, 80,000 for a vehicle, down to 40,000. And I don't get it. I don't know what's going on, but it just goes to show, the world of economics and politics and finance is something way beyond me. All right, so there you go. We had a 4th of July that didn't go so well for Trump, and otherwise, I hope you had a nice 4th of July, and I hope you enjoyed this. Like, subscribe, and notify, and take care, and look for Generally Speaking again.